One of the questions that we got from our kids in various forms, but for a surface level, the question just comes out: how can we affirm that God exists?
Yeah, and we know that a lot of teenagers are asking this question, and one of the reasons it's increasingly being asked in culture is because of what's being taught in our schools and culture's just continual argument that we don't need to believe in God anymore because science has proved that God doesn't exist. And yet, that's not a convincing argument. You can say it loudly, you can repeatedly say it, but it doesn't make it true. And Augustine has some pretty good thoughts to say to help us think through this.
Yeah, Augustine has kind of brought this out, and he gives us three potential conclusions, and he brings it out from the point of creation, or us being created beings. He says that if we exist, which we do, then there are three conclusions, potential conclusions to how we got here. Either one, we are eternal; number two, we are self-created; or number three, we are ultimately created by someone or something who is eternal.
Yeah, and as we were talking through that, we decided the first one we're not going to discuss in this video because we don't really believe that many of you teenagers are wrestling with whether you have existed for all of eternity. Really, the two main worldview things that are clashing in our culture right now is: has the universe created itself? Or is there an eternal being who created everything that we see and brought it out of nothing? And when it gets down to brass tacks, when it gets down to one of those two principles, the question we want you to ask is, what makes more sense? And we're going to argue that to think that the universe created itself is illogical.
Mm-hmm. And the reason that it's illogical is because in order for anything, the universe or anything, to create itself, it needs to exist first so that it create itself, so that it exists. So that's why it doesn't make very much sense, to me anyways, to come to that conclusion.
No, and R.C. Sproul has a funny analogy that it's like saying a magician needs to pull a rabbit out of a hat, but there's no rabbit, there's no hat, and there's no magician to do that. It just doesn't make sense. And so as you go through life and as you walk out of your house and the next time you do, look around at creation and look how it functions and how it works and think, is it even possible for it to create itself? And what makes more sense? That it just happened randomly, or that it was brought about by an intelligent designer? And which brings us to another point, I think, that is really helpful as we ask this question. We know that the world works in a purposeful way, that it has patterns. I mean, right now, as we're filming this video, we're in Minnesota, and we've got a blizzard going on out here. That was predicted over a week ago, almost 2 weeks ago, actually. People were posting on Facebook that we were going to have this massive blizzard today. Now, if the world was all random and purposeless, could we really predict that? And the answer is no. You couldn't predict anything. You couldn't predict that the laws of nature were going to continue. That the fact that all of these things function the way they function points to the fact that there was an intelligent, divine, eternal being that created it and created it to function this way. And the reason we argue this way is because God, through His Word in the Bible, tells us that creation reveals who He is. In the Old Testament, in the Psalms, Psalm 19 verses 1 through 2 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims His handiwork," that He made this. Day to day it pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. So as you look at creation, this verse says creation is screaming in your ears that there is a divine being that created it.
Mm-hmm. And in the same way, in the New Testament, Paul gives the same example, just in a little more different language, a little more logical way. He says the same thing in Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 19. And Paul writes, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they, human beings, are without excuse.
And it's important to answer this question as we wrap it up, to see that as you look out either your window and as you walk out of your house and see creation, it's telling you these things about God. That he is eternal, that he has existed forever, infinite. That he's powerful enough to bring all of creation into being, and that he is what we would call a divine being, that he would be God. If someone has existed for eternity and is powerful enough to create this, this would be who we call God. And so the question is, what makes more sense? That all of this came out of nothing randomly by chance, or that all of this was created by a God with a purpose in mind?